Does it feel like our world is just getting more and more chaotic? We've got wars, natural disasters, inflation, recession, AI, tariffs, mass layoffs. I can just keep going. And it doesn't help that our media and politics are so polarized, making it even harder to know what's actually happening and what's going to come next. So how are we supposed to stay resilient through all of this, let alone build lasting success? Now, a lot of self-help and business books define resilience as this ability to bounce back. Kind of like how a tennis ball would absorb impacts and bounce back to its original shape. But here's the thing, bouncing back is just one of the pillars of resilience. There are two more that are just as crucial, and only by understanding all three can we actually begin to navigate this chaotic world. Before we get into it though, it's worth noting that resilience is not some modern invention. Nature has been doing it for a while. Many species of plants, animal, fungi have made it through ice ages, asteroid impacts, and supervolcano eruptions. Entire ecosystems have been around even longer. How old do you think the Amazon rainforest is? 50 million years. And that's not even the oldest one. What's remarkable is that the same principles that make nature resilient can make us more resilient too. In fact, there's a whole field called systems science that studies just that. Universal principles in all the different kinds of systems, whether they are biological systems like forests or human systems like economies. My name is JT. And for the past 20 years, I have been compiling these principles into what I called the Universal Resilience Framework. My goal is to make these tools more accessible to everyone because I truly believe we can use them to build resilience and lasting success, not just for ourselves, but for the world around us. Okay, I know that was a long build-up. I do get a little bit too excited about these things sometimes. So here is the first pillar of resilience, stability, a principle from biology and engineering. Stability is the ability to maintain or restore yourself despite changes in the environment. This is what people mean by bouncing back, and we kind of see it everywhere. Our bodies keep a steady temperature despite how the weather changes throughout the day. Plants do it too, holding on to just the right amount of water even when the soil gets a little bit dry sometimes. In fact, stability is so common in biology, it has its own name, homeostasis. Stability is also key to personal and business resilience. Say you're driving on the freeway and someone cuts you off. So understandably that makes you angry, but then you take a few deep breaths. This simple act reduces your stress and brings you back to a calmer state. Or let's say there's a restaurant that just had a small fire. So the owner files an insurance claim, and this too restores their operation by replenishing their budget, which they then use to repair the damages. You see, these processes that absorb, reduce, repair, or replenish disruptions are exactly how you maintain stability. So knowing that, we can then increase stability by refining these processes, making them more effective and more responsive. For example, that restaurant can upgrade its insurance policy for bigger payouts. Or better yet, it can build an emergency fund to repair the damages immediately instead of waiting for the insurance companies to come through. However stability is achieved, the goal is the same: to return the system, whether it's an organism, a business, or your mental state, back to its original level before the environmental change. But this has its limits. While stability works well in environments with small temporary changes, it starts to break down when the changes are more severe, more frequent, or even permanent. Let's go back to our examples. What if instead of small impacts, that tennis ball gets locked in a vice grip for a whole month? It's probably never going to bounce back. What if you get cut off on the freeway multiple times a day, every single day? Deep breathing might help at first, but over time your patience will probably run dry. What if a global pandemic forces that restaurant to close for an entire year? Sure, the owner can keep buying more insurance policies against every possible disaster, but eventually the costs will add up and bankrupt the business. You see, when environmental changes are too severe or last too long, no amount of stabilizing processes can bring the system back to its original level without incurring devastating costs. So what are we supposed to do then in that kind of environment? Well, fortunately, this is where the second pillar of resilience comes in: adaptability. Adaptability is the ability to change yourself permanently in order to thrive better in a changed environment. Again, nature is full of examples of this. When we get sick, our immune systems can actually learn how to fight that pathogen so that we won't get nearly as sick the next time. And similarly, through generations of evolution, a species can gain new traits that allow them to better survive a new environment. Not surprisingly, our minds are also adaptive. Think back to that driving example. Instead of thinking other drivers are just out to get you, you can reframe the narrative. Maybe someone's rushing to an emergency, or just having a really bad day. And honestly, what's the rush anyway? Might as well enjoy the scenery. Once you get used to that perspective, you might not get angry in the first place. If this sounds familiar, it's because cognitive behavior therapy uses this kind of adaptive thinking to treat anxiety and depression with decades of proven results. And finally, when faced with the pandemic, an adaptable restaurant can change its business model and focus more on takeout and delivery. If done well, it might even lower costs and generate more revenue than it did before the pandemic. So then how do we increase adaptability? We can do so by actively exploring new ideas and diversifying our skills. For example, restaurants can experiment with new recipes every now and then. Such experiments might lower sales initially, but in the long run, it's more resilient to evolve with customers' changing tastes. Who knows? Maybe one of those experiments will become a new favorite. However you achieve adaptability, the goal is the same: to gain new skills that work better in the new environment. Here's an intuitive way to summarize everything so far. Stability is about resisting change, and adaptability is about harnessing change. But hold on, JT, you might say. Adaptability sounds pretty great. Why not just maximize it? Why not harness every change that comes our way? Well, here's the catch. Adaptability requires us to change ourselves. So when we overdo it, we become volatile, making it difficult to maintain any stability. We risk falling apart altogether. This is called overadaptation, a well-documented issue in psychology, biology, artificial intelligence, and just about any adaptive systems. Say you're in a relationship and whenever your partner does something hurtful, you always try to reframe it. Oh, she didn't really mean it. It's just her way of showing love. She'll come around eventually. At first, you're just compromising your needs a little bit. But over time, you might overlook actual abuse. And eventually, constantly adapting your perception to someone else will lead to a loss of identity. Similarly, picture a restaurant that completely revamped its operations to whatever is trendy that year. Vegan food one year, paleo cuisine the next, then suddenly adding robots as waiters just because AI is all the hype. Even if these trends last, the constant change in operation increases expense, alienates customers, and erases competitive advantages. If these volatile changes continue, the business will fail eventually. Now, there's an opposite problem to being too adaptive. You can be too stable too. We'll call it overstabilization. Consider a restaurant that refuses to upgrade its equipment for decades. I mean, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? Well, initially this might save some money, but their equipment will break sooner or later. And by then, the replacement parts might be discontinued, making it a lot more expensive to overhaul the entire system. These challenges reveal something deeper. Stability and adaptability don't operate in isolation. A highly adaptive process can undermine stability, while a highly stabilizing process can block adaptation. This also explains why so much popular advice seems to contradict itself. You've probably heard business gurus say things like, grit is the key to success. Just stay true to your goal. With enough effort, you will eventually succeed. But you probably also heard, no business has ever been successful without pivoting. So which is it? Should I stay true or should I pivot? What about this life advice? Be yourself, just be yourself. And this other one, just fake it until you make it. So should I be myself or should I fake it? What about embrace change but also stick to your principles? Set firm boundaries but also get out of your comfort zone. Don't compare but also learn from the best. These contradictions aren't just personal. They shape our debates as a society too. Tradition versus progress, regulation versus innovation, tariffs versus free trade. It doesn't matter which way you look at it. You cannot maximize stability and adaptability at the same time. Sometimes you need to resist change, and other times you need to harness it. This is why we need the third pillar of resilience, transformability. Transformability is the ability to dynamically balance and shift between stability and adaptability in order to handle any type of changes. Great, that sounds perfect. But how do we actually implement this? Let's start with the word balance. When you first hear it, your instinct is to aim for a 50-50 balance, splitting your resources equally between stability and adaptability. After all, if stability handles small short-term changes and adaptability handles large long-term ones, wouldn't an equal balance prepare you for everything? Not quite. And to explain this, we're going to take a short detour. You see, there's this phenomenon called power law, which says in many complex and chaotic environments, the frequency of a change is inversely proportional to some power of the impact of that change. I know that was a lot of math jargon. What this really means is that, relatively speaking, larger changes are less likely to occur than smaller changes. Now, this feels intuitive, but let's think of it in a different way so it's more applicable. It's called the 80-20 rule, which is a direct result of power law. The 80-20 rule shows us that roughly 80% of the outcome comes from just 20% of the causes. This might sound too magical to be true, but we do actually see this in many real-world environments. When we look at all of the natural disasters, about 80% of the total damage comes from just 20% of the disasters. Likewise, on construction sites, 80% of the injuries come from just 20% of the safety hazards. This pattern isn't just limited to negative outcomes. In retail, 80% of the sales often comes from 20% of the products. In the stock market, 80% of the gains often comes from 20% of the stocks. What's even more fascinating is that this pattern often repeats itself. If you zoom into that top 20%, you will often find another 80-20 rule inside of it. For example, in that 20% of natural disasters, the ones that cause the most damage, we'll likely find that 80% of that damage comes from an even smaller 20% of those disasters. These kinds of patterns that repeat at smaller or larger scales are called fractals. Much like how a branch of a tree often has the same shape as the whole tree. And then on that branch, you can find smaller branches that also have the same shape. We'll come back to this fractal idea a bit later. A quick note on the 80-20 rule. The numbers aren't exact. Sometimes it can be 70-30 or 90-10. They don't always add up to 100 either. And when we look at the actual math, which is power law, the ratios can change at different scales too. Still, the core idea remains the same. A minority of causes creates the majority of outcomes. So for simplicity, we'll keep using 80-20. The 80-20 rule has a lot of applications. The most popular one is for managing priorities. You've probably heard something like, you should prioritize high-impact, low-effort tasks before low-impact, high-effort tasks. We'll call this 80-20 prioritization, but we won't cover this today because a lot of people have covered this before. Instead, we'll talk about something that doesn't get nearly as much attention. I call it 80-20 balance. This means that, on average, you should allocate 80% of your resources to stability and 20% to adaptability so that it matches the 80-20 patterns in most environments. Many successful companies allocate their budgets this way. Roughly 80% goes to ongoing operations, like maintaining sales, replenishing inventories, repairing equipment, managing staffs, and so on. The remaining 20% then goes to research and development, because a breakthrough innovation might just help them adapt to a large market disruption or opportunity. In fact, within that 80%, you can apply the 80-20 balance again. Google famously formalized this approach with their 70-20-10 model. They start with a 90-10 budget. 90% goes to ongoing operations, and 10% goes to breakthrough innovations. Then they split that 90% into 70-20. 70% goes to just running the operations, but 20% goes to refining those operations, like making their existing products faster and cheaper. You see, by adding a small amount of adaptability inside the larger stability, you make the stability operations more flexible to changes too. This repeating 80-20 balance at smaller or larger scales is another example of fractals, which makes sense because if the environment follows a fractal 80-20 pattern, we should match it with a fractal 80-20 balance. In other words, when you have dynamic balances of stability and adaptability at every scale of a system, the whole system becomes even more resilient. Nature budgets in the same way. It's called the dynamic energy budget. Organisms dedicate the majority of their energy on stability, maintaining survival functions like digestion and respiration, while investing a minority in adaptability, things like learning and reproduction. Amazingly, this pattern is consistent across all species, from animals to bacteria. And yes, nature's budgeting is fractal too. Within that larger stability budget, most energy goes towards running the survival functions, but a smaller portion goes to refining them, like improving nutrient absorption and growing lung capacity. Now, I want to remind you again, the 80 and 20 are not meant to be exact numbers. Your unique circumstances might warrant a slightly different balance. This actually leads to our next point, and it has to do with the word dynamic in our definition of transformability. You see, while on average, you want your balance to be around 80-20, it's not meant to be fixed. When the environment is in a phase of mostly small, manageable changes, you want to lean more toward stability, maybe something like a 90-10 balance. But when the environment transitions into a phase of mostly large, disruptive changes, it makes sense to shift more toward adaptability, maybe closer to 60-40, or something even more extreme. This is how we will define the word transformation. Switching between focusing more on stability or focusing more on adaptability, depending on whether the environment is in a stable phase or a disruptive phase. It's also another example of the fractal 80-20 balance. Only here it's zoomed out across a long period of time. We can roughly group transformations into two types: incremental transformation and radical transformation. A radical transformation involves breaking down an old system and rebuilding a new one from the ground up. It's often necessary when the environment has changed so much that it's completely different than before. In other words, a radical transformation through a radical change. A great example of this in nature is metamorphosis. A caterpillar transforms into a butterfly by first dissolving many of its organs, then rebuilding them into new tissues. This allows the butterfly to thrive in an entirely different environment. We also saw an example of radical transformation in our restaurant story. When the economy is stable, the restaurant can mostly maintain their ongoing dine-in operation and occasionally experiment with new recipe. This is your typical 80-20 balance. But when the environment changes radically, like with a multi-year pandemic, the restaurant might have to completely shut down its dine-in operation to reduce losses and go all in on takeout and delivery. Now, this balance focuses almost purely on adaptability, something like 30-70. Once the pandemic is over, the restaurant can then shift back to an 80-20 balance, or even 90-10. This shift back toward stability is critical. The restaurant must now refine its new business model, like improving the efficiency of the delivery process and growing the new customer base, so that it can sustainably compete as the economy becomes stable again. This kind of stabilization is also important for preventing over-adaptation, especially after a radical transformation. We see this often in mental health. For example, after a traumatic event, some people might develop chronic anxiety. In a way, they have to be hyper-aware and hyper-vigilant in order to adapt and survive at the time. But if those patterns persist long after the crisis is over, they can actually reduce resilience, causing people to overreact to small changes as if they were major threats. And then in addition to over-adaptation, there's still the problem of unpredictability. We don't always know when the environment will enter or exit a disruptive phase. What if the pandemic ended much sooner than expected, but that restaurant had already taken out multiple loans to overhaul its entire business before any infection even reached that country? That kind of overcommitment of resources can sometimes do more damage than doing nothing at all. That's why we also need incremental transformation. Instead of a massive transformation, we can use small iterations of adaptation and stabilization, allowing the system to transform over time without overcommitting resources at any point. Not surprisingly, nature does this all the time. When a tree grows, it starts by sending out many small branches in different directions. And because they're small, they're very adaptive, easily bending towards light. And even if one branch gets damaged by a falling rock or blocked by another tree, it's not a big loss. Another branch can just grow somewhere else. In other words, the tree explores all the growth options using a bunch of small tests. The viable one then get refined into thicker branches, laying the stable foundation for even more exploration and growth later on. This way, it doesn't stray too far from the 80-20 balance, growing incrementally without risking too much, while still leaving room to adapt to uncertainty. In animals, the same strategy shows up as play. That's why kittens, puppies, and babies love to crawl into little spaces and tinker with random objects. These small experiments help them grow and learn in a low-stake environment. In fact, play is so beneficial that nature made it feel joyful, so we keep doing it. For those of you in software development, incremental transformation might sound familiar. It's essentially the same principle behind agile development, and specifically the minimum viable product, or as I like to call it, the minimum viable test. The minimum viable test follows 3 steps. Step 1, create something simple but valuable. Step 2, test it early to gather useful feedback. Step 3, use this feedback to either refine existing features or pivot to new features, aka stabilize or adapt. Dropbox is a great example of this. Their initial idea was simple. Users could place files in a folder on one computer, and those files would automatically sync online, making them accessible from any device. It was a great solution to the hassle of using thumb drives. But building this idea was technically complex and expensive. What if after spending millions, they found out people didn't actually want it? So the Dropbox team found a clever way to test this idea quickly and cheaply. They made a short video demonstrating how the app would work before it was even fully functional. When they posted the video, it generated 70,000 signups overnight, confirming the idea's potential without risking too much. Now, early feedback isn't just helpful for confirming good ideas. It's also helpful for learning when to pivot away from bad ones. For example, Instagram actually started as something else called Bourbon, a location check-in app where users could plan meetups, earn points, and share photos. But when the founders analyzed early user behaviors, they discovered something unexpected. Most people ignore the check-in feature, but they love the photo sharing feature. So the team made a bold decision to pivot, stripping away everything except photo sharing, filters, and comments. This new app, rebranded as Instagram, gained 1 million users in just 2 months. Now, I'm not here to fanboy Instagram or Dropbox. Luck certainly played a role. Both companies were started in one of the largest tech boom in history, but plenty of startups existed back then. What sets these companies apart was their ability to not only test ideas quickly to conserve resources, but also grow the viable ideas into stable, thriving operations. However, we have to be careful here. Incremental transformation is a powerful way to learn and grow, but growth itself is not the goal. Resilience is. While some growth is helpful for establishing stability, too much of it can create overstabilization, which hinders adaptability. Our society is learning this exact lesson. We've grown so fast and so large that it takes decades to make meaningful changes. And to make matters worse, much of that growth has only made the rich even richer, instead of building the resilience of our healthcare, employment, democratic, and climate systems. And as global crises pile up one after another, we now find ourselves underprepared, unable to adapt quickly, not because we lack resources, but because we fail to invest them wisely. We chose growth over resilience. But I still have hope, because nature is resilient, and we're part of nature. That means resilience is already in us. We just need to relearn how to use it. By now, I hope you see just how universal stability, adaptability, and transformability are. I hope you see that resilience isn't just about bouncing back. It's something far more profound. It's the ability to navigate change itself, the only constant in life. To know when to resist change, when to harness it, and when to transform through it. And that is what lasting success truly means: to thrive in chaos. These three pillars are just the beginning, part one of the Universal Resilience Framework. They lay the foundation, the essential traits every resilient system must have. Parts 2, 3, and 4 will go deeper. You'll learn how to design specific processes and practices of resilience, how to organize resilient teams, communities, and movements, how to analyze, predict, and even shape your environment, and finally, how to cultivate a society and a planet that thrive together, not just for centuries, but potentially for millions of years. Also, I've created a worksheet that will guide you through how to apply the three pillars to various areas of your life. You can get it by signing up for my free newsletter at universalresilience.com. If that's not enough, in my upcoming talks, I will show you how to apply the three pillars specifically to career resilience and mental resilience. I will also introduce 2 more strategies for transformability that we didn't cover today. And as more of these related talks come out, I'll link them in the description below. Okay, last thing before we wrap up. This talk is for educational purpose only. It's not medical, mental health, financial, or legal advice. Please consult a licensed professional about your specific needs. That said, if you do find it helpful, please hit like and subscribe. Also, drop a comment and let me know what areas of resilience you would like me to talk about next. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you next time.